Okay. Jason, you want to get started?
Absolutely. Just doing a quick audio check. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds good.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CMAP Economic Development Committee. My name is Jason Keller, for those that I don't know. I am a Community and Economic Development Senior Advisor with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and happy to be leading this group here and this meeting this morning. All of you should have the agenda. There are a couple of changes that we're going to walk through, but I want to start off with a statement that as permitted by the governor's disaster declaration of August 21st, 2020, the determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee to meet in person. To ensure a transparent and open meeting as much as possible, we will continue to post the meeting materials approximately 1 week in advance, and we'll provide a recording of this meeting linked on our website, and we'll take all votes by roll call. So you will see in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, the conversation is being recorded, so just please know that if you are not comfortable with being recorded, please exit the meeting now. We're also going to make one other change by moving up an agenda item. So at this time, I would like to combine the attendance roll call with the approval of the last meeting minutes, as well as you will see down at the bottom, the proposed 2021 meeting schedule. So dates put forward is January 26th, March 22nd, June 28th, and October 25th. So as we go through to move to approve the minutes, we're also going to essentially approve those meeting dates for 2021. So do I have a motion to approve the minutes of the June 22nd meeting? Please state your name and say so moved.
Kevin Kramer, so moved.
Do I have a second?
Michael.
Okay, are there any? I'm sorry, was there a second? If there was a, John, are you talking, Mr. Furr?
I am not, but I'm happy to second. This is John.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm seeing the little screens in my head pop in and out of their mute, so I apologize for that. So are there any other questions from committee members about those minutes or the dates in 2021? All right, so motion passes. We will be sending out calendar invites for the 2021 session, so I appreciate us taking care of that piece of business. So with that, Austin, I will move to you for a roll call of the full committee.
Yes, and actually we need to do a roll call and vote by voice because we're trying to abide by the Open Meetings Act as best we can. So if we can, I'll read through the committee members in alphabetical order by last name, and if you could just make sure that you're on mute, say here, and then say yay or nay if you approve the motion, both for the minutes and for next year's meeting dates. Okay, so we can start off with the chair, Jason.
Present and yay.
Thank you. Dion Bowe. Don't think I saw her this morning. Murray Castaldi. Also didn't see her this morning. Lisa Castillo Richmond.
Here and yay.
Thank you. Kevin Considine.
Here and yay.
Thank you. Peter Kretikos.
Here and yay.
Thank you. Lorenzo. Sochi Flores. Irene, would you like to be voting for Sochi?
Sure. Yes, if that's permissible.
Yes, I think it is. Jonathan.
Here and yay.
Thank you. Brian Gay.
Here and yay.
Terrence Hall. No. Okay. Emily Harris.
Here and yay.
Thank you. Michael Horsting.
Here and yay.
Gretchen Kleiner? No. Kevin Kramer?
Here, yay.
Thank you. Marissa Lewis?
Here, yay.
Thank you. Joey Mack?
Here and yay.
Jonathan McGee? No. Kathleen?
Agnes Masnick is here for DCEO. And if I'm allowed to vote, yay.
Great, thank you. Kathleen Nelson?
Here and yay.
Thank you. Kelly O'Brien? No. Henry Pierce? Lance Pressel?
Here and yay.
Doug Pryor?
Here and yay.
John Reinert? And Jennifer Taman?
Here and yay.
Great. I know a couple people joined while we were running through that, so if there were any committee members who were joining us late, we just want to do a quick roll call vote by voice and then also approve a motion to approve the minutes and the meeting dates for next year. So did I miss anyone who joined late?
Hi, Austin. Terrence Hall here, and yay.
Thank you, Terrence. Anyone else? Okay, that was seamless. Thank you, everyone. Okay, back to you, Jason.
Great. Thank you for everybody going through that. No, it's not typical to how we are organized, but it's important to have everyone's voice documented. And as far as we go through the presentations, I think it would probably be good if you do have a question, maybe start that in the chat box first and let the presenter get through his or her materials. And then we can then open the floor for conversation. So if you do have a chat or a question or a comment, maybe flag it in the chat and we can get through it. So I do appreciate everyone's flexibility for that. So the first presentation is Invest Southwest, and Gerardo, I believe you're up first.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me and for letting me share a little bit about the work that the Department of Planning is doing here in the city. I'm afraid we don't use GoToMeeting very much at DPD. Does anyone have? Can anyone tell me how I would share my screen?
Yes, I'm going to make you a presenter now, and you should be able to choose which application you want to show.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can. We're currently looking at the front end of PowerPoint if you then want to make it full screen.
How's that? It should be full screen now.
Still looking at PowerPoint.
Seems like there may be a lag. You may want to give it a second.
Okay.
Are you guys seeing full screen yet?
No.
Okay. How about now?
I think you have to enter full screen before you share your screen and then select that particular window for us to see.
Oh, there we go.
Did that work?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks, everyone. Again, Gerardo Garcia, architect and urban designer with the Department of Planning and Development here in Chicago. Also the lead planner for the West Planning region. So just want to, again, thank everyone for having us. And really the goal here is to give everyone an overview of Invest Southwest and kind of where we are in that process. So I unfortunately do have to jump off at 10 o'clock. So I'm going to go through some of this content a little bit fast, but if there are any questions that we don't get to, I'll throw my contact info in the chat box and glad to follow up after this session. So Invest Southwest, it's really a strategy that the Department of Planning is actually celebrating our one-year kickoff today. The mayor is in North Lawndale today doing just that. And really it's about catalyzing investment on 10 neighborhoods on the south and west sides of the city over 12 of their commercial corridors. And it's designed to do so in a way that really provides a sense of equity and investment. And the idea is that public investment happens all over the city, and our analysis really show that it's happening everywhere. What's not happening along with that to really leverage it is private investment and the other good things that come with that type of catalyst. And so really Invest Southwest is trying to leverage the city's investment to catalyze economic development on the south and west sides of the city. And a little bit of how that's working. You know, to kick off, we really about a year ago started looking at what was planned and underway in a lot of these Invest Southwest communities across city agencies, and identified all of these projects in a way that that were at a place where they could actually be catalytic and even more transformational if we leverage them in certain ways. So we identified about $500 million of that type of investment, and then set aside from TIF, from the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund, another $250 million to try to supplement that. And then we set another goal for another $250 million of public and private capital to really put together a strategy that is hopefully taking investment that was already planned and using new capital to, again, really try to create catalytic projects in these communities. And so overall, you know, the strategy is really about finding local assets and finding ways to amplify them. And you know, you see here the Laramie State Bank in on Chicago Avenue in Austin that I'll talk about in a bit. It's also about, you know, focusing the public investments that we do have to ensure that we're listening to communities and supporting local priorities. And an example of that could be the Northtown Library with affordable housing. And you know, we want to drive private investment to really build local wealth, and so these strategies are really about empowering local CDCs, local investors to not just for the city to come in with a bunch of projects, but to actually build local wealth. And the RFPs that I'll get into in a second are written really in a way to try to encourage that. And you know, a lot of the discussion in the communities that we're working with revolves around public safety, and so really thinking about what kind of strategies can we deploy that think about public safety in a more integrated way. And in order to do this, we really had to mobilize and really our department and restructure it. So now we have essentially 7 planning areas across the city, as you can see here on the map, with a team of dedicated planners to each of those areas. And the idea is that this type of focus brings a higher level of coordination, as well as just a better understanding of what's going on the ground and communities in our different regions. And in order to really do that, we also had to supplement that with new staff. And so all of the folks here in red outline are actually new hires that have occurred over the course of the last year. And just to give you a little bit more sense of who those folks are, you know, in addition to just building out a department that's structured to be able to work in this way, you know, the benefit of that is also just a neighborhood planning region that's as diverse as the city itself. And that allows us to really engage communities in meaningful ways. These are our community kickoff events, which seem to be a thing of the past in our new kind of reality, but these were done at the beginning and end of this year, end of last year. And these were about 500 people events where we kind of gathered our first initial sense of priorities from our different communities on the south and west side. Since then, we've transitioned to neighborhood roundtables, which are, you know, groups of up to 30 or 40 stakeholders where we're meeting monthly virtually. So what this has led to was really this idea of how do we repurpose or leverage the assets that we have on our commercial corridors. And we realize is that we have clusters of city-owned land around all of these corridors. And so we thought that the best way to really encourage competition and encourage development here was through an RFP process, but really thinking about how we rethink that process so that it goes beyond, you know, a traditional RFP that, you know, offers a piece of land in exchange for development, but also talks about like the desired level of urbanism that we'd like to see, along with uses that, you know, are a desire of the community, but dovetailing that with a market analysis and financial feasibility to, one, ensure that what we're proposing in the RFP is actually feasible from a market perspective, and that the city is bringing its resources to bear and making that expectation clear for development teams. So the first round that we did were in Austin on Chicago and Laramie, in Inglewood on 63rd and Halsted, and in Auburn Gresham on 79th and Halsted. And just to give you a sense of what the Austin RFP looked like, it was really a corridor analysis where we looked at the entire scope of city-owned and privately owned land that we identified as opportunities. And so when you aggregate all that together, you're looking at about 5 total acres and about 324,000 square feet of development potential. And what the market analysis for Austin in particular found was that there's a lot of retail leakage to the western suburbs, so Oak Park, for example. And that really jived well with what we heard from the community in terms of, you know, folks would really shop on their commercial corridor if they could, if they had the places to do so. And the market analysis really yielded, you know, this understanding that this corridor could actually support a small urban grocery format or a pharmacy, and that's what's shown in this development concept here. You know, another concept could show multifamily housing with ground floor retail or cultural spaces. But the one that we honed in on was the concept that you're seeing on the screen here, which is at the intersection of Laramie and Chicago. And it's really an adaptive reuse of the Laramie State Bank, which is a Chicago landmark and is currently vacant and in poor condition. And so this is a view of the bank currently and the rest of the site. And what's interesting here is that all of these parcels are actually privately owned, but we were able to, we've worked with both property owners in this case to get their consent to RFP the property. And this is just a very high level development concept of what that site could be like. And that's included in the RFP. So again, this idea of really being clear about the level of urbanism everything down to this kind of open space underneath the building, and the program are all laid out in the RFP. Really quickly, Auburn Gresham, 79th and Halsted. What was interesting here is, again, to this notion of leveraging the Auburn Gresham Development Corporation, Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation, was also a Chicago Prize winner for the Healthy Lifestyle Hub. Has put together this proposal for an adaptive reuse of a building, and you can kind of see their funding stack for this project. And so, being that this project is coming to fruition, we essentially thought that along this corridor, the site that made the most sense would be across the street. And so you're creating this kind of node of activity next to each other with two projects that are both essentially heavily subsidized by the city and have diverse funding stacks. So just a little bit of more of a pulled back version, a mixed unit, multifamily building with ground floor retail to complement the Healthy Lifestyle Hub across the street. And so Englewood Square Phase 2, essentially Phase 1 of this development was the Whole Foods and some retail outlots that you see here in the aerial. Not sure if everyone can see my mouse, but Phase 2 or is really the idea of how do we tie that all together with a larger strategy for the site. And so central to this, and this is a theme that really came up and really through our early engagement with folks, is that each of these communities tend to have these iconic buildings that they're really drawn to. And so in this case, there's a firehouse essentially in the middle of the site. And so really explored development concepts and development scenarios that could look at how that space could be adaptively reused to meet the community's needs as part of a larger development. And so again, fronting 79th Street, we have a more dense multifamily building, again, ground floor retail, mixed use environment. And so just to give everyone a sense, this is an overall timeline for, as I mentioned earlier, we have 12 corridors for Invest Southwest. We've just completed RFPs for the first 3. We're currently working on a November release, and the idea is that we'll have a quarterly cadence of RFPs essentially. So right now we're working on North Lawndale, Back of the Yards, Bronzeville, and South Chicago. And the idea really is that all of these different corridors will have, groundbreakings or be under construction by as early as 2022 and through 2023. And so just to give you a sense of where we are with the RFPs, this is an image from the Commercial Avenue South Chicago RFP, where again, we're exploring site massings with the community. We just had our visioning workshop and really going through the process of seeing what scale and what type of development works for the various opportunity sites there. So again, a key part of the RFP is the evaluation criteria, and I alluded to this earlier, but really looking at, wealth building, meaningful wealth building, both short and long term in these communities. And so, a way to potentially do that is we want to see creative and innovative partnerships that really yield equitable control and decision making to local partners in these communities and local partners of color. And for these development teams, we also want to see a track record of making investments on the south and west sides of the city, and support from community-based organizations, along with the technical competence and economic feasibility. But so this is essentially our approach to leveraging the investment that the city is essentially putting forth for these RFPs with the private investment that'll come out of it, to create opportunities both in terms of near-term jobs, but really long-term wealth building in these communities. And this is all laid out in the RFP. Another thing that we're doing as part of this process is we came out the Chicago Architecture Center released a pre-qualified design services firms list in partnership with us. And again, this idea that we want to encourage these projects in these communities, but we also want to make sure that they're achieving a high level of design and urbanism. And as these development teams are putting together their teams, this is a resource for developers to really know that, one, these are firms that can achieve a high level of design excellence, but also have experience and capacity to work in communities like those on the south and west sides of Chicago. And with that, I've got a couple minutes, so glad to answer any quick questions. And again, I'll throw my contact in the chat for anyone that would like to follow up, and really sorry to kind of have to run off.
Okay, thank you very much. I didn't see anything in the chat specifically. The one question I had, this is Jason, the one question I had, Gerardo, is I didn't hear you mention anything about opportunity zones and whether if any of these parcels are part of private sector capital investment as part of opportunity zones. Is there any alignment there that you may want to speak of? Yeah, there is. A couple of these sites are in opportunity zones, and the RFPs get into that a little bit more in detail, but certainly a resource there that we would, where it's available, we would hope developers could come forth with a package that includes that.
Hi, Gerardo. It's Austin. I'm curious if, when designing this program, if y'all were looking at any particular models, either in the region or across the country, that have pursued a similar strategy.
Yeah. So obviously, our Commissioner Cox, came to Chicago from Detroit, and this is a strategy that Detroit employed with some of their larger swaths of land, and probably because they have so much land, they were able to do it a little bit differently there. But a lot of that work that was RFP, a couple years ago, we're now starting to see under construction or even finalized there. In terms of the community wealth building aspect of things, we did kind of take a wider view, and through our policy folks in the mayor's office kind of research best practices there and included those in the RFP for reference, so that, this is our interpretation of it, but we also want development teams to know where it's coming from. And Gerardo, this is Jason again. We did have one question come through the chat box. Are there any connections to education and workforce development through Invest Southwest funding? Not direct at the moment. The idea here is that, if the department is going to put all of its resources on the table, kind of how we've done, then we want to see these types of partnerships that look at workforce development, that look at supporting small businesses, local small businesses. And so those types of partnerships we're hoping will kind of come to fruition through the RFP process. Okay. Go ahead. Oh no, I was going to say thank you. If I know you have to run, but did you have any closing comments? No, again, thanks everyone for letting us share some of our work here today. And really sorry I have to run off, but I did throw my email in the chat box, so glad to follow up if anyone has any questions or thoughts they'd like to share. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Moving on to the agenda, we've got an update on the CRGC.
Yes, I think we'll ask Kevin Costine to provide that.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you. Just real quick, and building on the brief that was in the agenda, the Chicago Regional Growth Corp was formed officially in 2018 after, Irene, you could check me, probably 2 years of sort of strategic planning and formation there among the 7 counties in the city of Chicago. And after a couple years of accomplishing a few good things, so particularly in in the export development for small businesses with an export tech program and a number of grants. And the funding for CRGC as it was born was 3-year commitments from the counties and the city, as well as some decent funding primarily from the JP Morgan Chase Foundation. And that was really driven towards the export building functions. That this summer, after running through that funding and looking at what we'd accomplished and sort of where it was going, the board of CRGC decided to sort of call a strategic pause, if you will, not seeing an immediate way forward, but not wanting to completely shelve the concept. So we did eliminate the couple of staff positions at the end of July, and just sort of buttoning up the organization. And importantly, though, all of those supporting organizations and members remain really committed to the idea of regional economic development. I think there will probably be some formal kind of postmortem efforts, though there have been a number of meetings and quite a few conversations around, okay, what worked, what didn't, how do we want to, when we tackle this again, what do we learn and what do we want to do differently? I think there are a couple of key learnings there that will continue to flesh out and frankly work with CMAP and others to continue the conversations among the counties and the city and the regional economic development organizations, or through each of those groups to see where we go. But I think there seems to be some renewed vigor around the concept of regional economic development, particularly as we come out of the recovery efforts from COVID-19, and we're excited about where we can go from here, having learned quite a bit from this experience. Happy to field any questions that anybody has.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Didn't see any questions in the chat, so I will open up the floor to any committee members with any questions or comments for Kevin.
This is Emily. I'd love to just hear what some of those key findings and learnings are for next time around.
Sure. No surprise that the first one is perhaps figuring out a more sustainable funding model. No great shock there, probably to any organization. And in deciding what that model is, what the public-private mix is going to be, how to best go about that, and frankly, how to work with each of the county's organizations who also have public-private funding structures and thus goals, and how to make that all work together. And then the other piece was probably just sort of continued syncing up of the goals across all of the organizations, and what makes sense from a joint commitment. Where can we all work together, and acknowledging sort of tacitly that there are things that we also compete on, and how do we get over those hurdles? Those are probably the primary two.
Thanks.
Okay, last call for questions or comments to Kevin.
Actually, Jason, it's Irene. I'm just wondering if I could add to what Kevin said, if we have a minute, which is simply that I think one of the other things that happened over the course of the time that we started planning everything was the change in leadership at each of the county boards and at the city. And so, which I think, and this is more of a personal view, underscores the importance of the private sector leadership and engagement, because when you look at models around the country, the private sector engagement and leadership is key. And one of the values of that is that it doesn't change with every election cycle. And so I think that's something that everybody's aware of as well.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you, Kevin, for your comments. Moving forward, I believe we're turning the floor over to Lindsay to discuss the Garfield Green Line South Action Plan. Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Yes.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to wait for Austin to make me a presenter so I can share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see that? Okay. So thank you for having me here to talk about the Garfield Green Line Station Action Plan. This is an equitable transit-oriented development plan initiated by Elevated Chicago, which is a collaboration of 17 public, private, and nonprofit organizations, including CMAP, that have come together to build equity into transit-oriented development in Chicago by improving health, safety, climate resilience, and cultural vitality indicators for people of color living and working near transit. So for the Garfield Station, CMAP is working with local community groups and Michael at the RTA to update the Elevated Community Work Plan with the specific goal of continuing the progress or the process of turning this station into a community asset. So one of the important aspects of this is understanding the impact that decades of disinvestment have had and work to change the narrative around a community with strong positive amenities. So our team is developing and emphasizing collaborative community-led solutions to neighborhood displacement and inequities. And we've started with a super deep dive into the history of the area. So I'm going to take you down my rabbit hole here today. This is a map from the Chicago History Museum from 1804 showing the primary trade routes around the region. And the area was low-lying and swampy, and the red lines are showing those trade routes that were on top of ridges that have been left by glaciers. And these routes were used by several tribes, including Potawatomi, Peoria, Miami, Kickapoo, and Sioux. And the Garfield Station falls on what used to be called the Vincennes Trail, named after a French trader, and still exists in parts as Vincennes Avenue. So I'm using Prezi. It's a little bit outdated, but I think it's kind of fun to have that interactive visual. We were very interested in looking at the population trends in the area from the Washington Park community area. So this is a graphic showing the population trends over time and along with significant events in Chicago and Washington Park specifically. So going back to the 1860s, we had a lot of Irish and Germans arriving in the area to work in the meatpacking and railroad industries. And after the fire of 1871, both rich and poor alike were moving out of the center city, and the South Side really began expanding rapidly. The park itself was dedicated in 1879. So industry was booming between 1905 and 1908, at which time there were 5 branches of what is the Green Line South that were built between those years. So this map is showing what are the existing and former stations being shown with X's. So you can see we've lost a lot of that connection to transit in the neighborhoods in the area. So with the start of World War I, we had industries up here and in the north generally that were facing significant labor shortages because we had restricted European immigration. So recruiters began looking heavily to the south and encouraging African Americans to move to the north to escape the discrimination down there and to get much higher wages. So between 1914 and 1919, beginning of the Great Migration, about 1 million Black people moved north. And in Chicago, the Black population grew by 148%. And following the end of the World War I, the GIs came home to a different landscape. There were fewer jobs available. And with such a huge increase in the population, while we still had racially restrictive housing covenants, sundown towns, and there was also physical violence was used to limit where Black people could live in the area. And so much of the housing where Black people were allowed to live was overpriced and overcrowded. So racial tensions were very high. And in the summer of 1919, 17-year-old Eugene Williams was drowned for being on a raft that drifted into what was the white area of the beach. And when police refused to arrest the man who had been seen as throwing the rock that hit Eugene, there were uprisings and riots in the area. It was a week of violence where white gangs sought to establish their prominence in the neighborhood. So they enacted a lot of violence in the area. And in response, there were Black gangs that formed to defend themselves. And actually, this was 16 days of violence, which was known as the Red Summer. And the Chicago Commission on Race Relations found that rioting was essentially the result of several key issues: competition for jobs, inadequate housing conditions for Black people, inconsistent law enforcement, and pervasive racial discrimination. So there was a lot going on then. Our transit ridership in the area peaked in 1926. And as it fell, after that point, city leaders began looking for ways to adapt the city to the private automobile. So that same year, 1926, racially restrictive covenants were upheld by the Supreme Court. And in the decade that followed, that increasing car usage led to high levels of congestion, both at the city level and suburban areas. Moving into 1940, I'm sure you've all heard about the redlining maps. The Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation created the first maps, redline maps of Chicago, identifying areas by racial composition for risk in home security mortgages, making it extremely difficult for Black people or anyone in integrated neighborhoods to secure loans or generate wealth from home ownership. It also had the effect of blocking commercial enterprises from getting loans when the whole area was identified as being risky. So we had some developers and real estate leaders and professionals from the Metropolitan Planning and Housing Council, which we now know as MPC. They identified an opportunity to address the so-called blight by clearing slums and opening up areas for new development. They also thought this could potentially increase housing. So they presented the mayor at the time with a housing plan, they lobbied at the state level, and urban renewal was born. And the idea was they'd solve the overcrowded housing by clearing out the slums and building new housing. But the white opposition to integration meant that most public housing went into Black neighborhoods in the form of enormous high-rise towers. And we built highways funded by our predecessor agency, CATS, and laid them down through neighborhoods that ended up enforcing segregation on the south side. Meanwhile, 3 branches of the Green Line ended in the 1950s, just as population was peaking. Let's see, the towers that were built in Washington Park were the Robert Taylor homes, pretty infamous. They housed 27,000 people, and there was so much demand for housing that they had to turn people away. So they focused on prioritizing households with children. So the young population exploded, and the Chicago public school system, although they had been warned by the Housing Authority, they did not provide the resources to accommodate the increase in school children. And from Eve Ewing's book, we learned that rather than allowing students to enroll in the white schools, the district officials created double shifts where Black students would attend school for only half the day and then trade off with a second group. And the clearly inferior, overcrowded, underfunded schools in the Black community added to the growing frustrations in the early 60s for basic civil rights. 1967, Dr. King publicly condemned the Vietnam War, which essentially aligned the anti-war movement with the civil rights movement. So while we had hippies celebrating the Summer of Love in '67, the poor housing conditions and abusive policing and institutional employment in the Black community culminated in the uprisings and riots across the US in the summer of '67, known as the Long Hot Summer. The Kerner Commission created or did an investigation into the root causes of rioting, and they found a couple of things. That first, persistent societal inequalities were to blame, and specifically it said that white racism was to blame, that white institutions created ghettos and maintained them. And they also, when they were trying to identify who was most likely to riot, they found two things. First, they said we shouldn't call it a riot because that would indicate that the actions were irrational, and they weren't irrational. Because they were a reaction to inhumane conditions, and that what led a person to be most likely to participate in an uprising was having been the victim or witness to police brutality. And so this really resonated with us over the summer as we were studying the history and seeing what was happening in Chicago. So the following year, Dr. King was assassinated, the Civil Rights Act of '68 was passed, and Chicago held the infamous Democratic Convention. After that, the war on drugs emerged, and that was in part to malign the anti-war hippies and the poor Black and brown city dwellers. And so they ended up targeting gang leaders in Chicago, and that ended up breaking up the larger gangs into smaller factions, which increased the violence significantly. So this layering of many oppressive policies and poor living conditions meant that those who could leave did, and population, as you see from 1970, fell off in the area. And this is how disinvestment leads to displacement. And in the 1990s, CTA made even more cuts to the Green Line service and stations. The federal support for transit dried up from $41.5 million in 1991 to nothing in 1998. But in the last decade, we have seen, thanks to passionate advocates and community leaders, the Washington Park neighborhood has seen a number of positive investments, including some artist lofts, a new performing arts center through the University of Chicago, the Clio apartments, and a beautiful renovation of the CTA station, and even some new sidewalks on Calumet. So it's important for us to take in all that has happened to the community up to this point, to understand the current conditions and to understand the potential skepticism of any government agency coming in saying we want to help you and do something, and to listen to the community voices to best understand and know what they need to thrive. And one thing that we are about to embark upon as part of our existing conditions report is what's called a power analysis. So thinking about who has the power to make certain decisions about the community. And I think that's something that'll be really useful when it comes to developing recommendations for the project and who can actually implement them and make that change. Oops, I guess I didn't get my last slide of the timeline. But let me see if I can go back. Or never mind. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna just, okay. Will it take me back? No, okay. Well, we are wrapping up the existing conditions report, and the pandemic really did push back our overall timeline, especially for public engagement efforts, but we are trying to work out how we can engage with the community, because we know that we can't rely completely on online efforts, but we are building up our online engagement platform with Engagement HQ. And we estimate that the project will take about 24 months. And I think that's really going to depend on how well we can reach people in a pandemic, because we really need to have that direct touch with the community to understand what they need and help them develop a vision for the future. So that is my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and open it up if anyone has any questions about the process. Oh, and I could add on that the partnership with RTA is to really help elevate the community role, and RTA is providing a grant to a local community partner to help with the engagement efforts.
All right, any questions? Looks like we have a comment from Emily commending your work, so you can see that in the chat box. So thank you for that. Any other questions or comments from other committee members?
Thank you.
And this is Jason. The only other thing I will add to the history is that, you know, again, Chicago very much was part of the Community Reinvestment Act movement in 1977, 76, and helped with the passage through Gail Sincata's work and really grassroots community action planning. So the Federal Reserve has put out information on the history of the CRA that could be part of your timeline as you go forward, as we were uniquely positioned to help drive the policy agenda nationally. And also for those of you who have been keeping in touch with the Federal Reserve's advance notice of proposed rulemaking, CRA is currently up for public comment. So you are encouraged to reach out to me or go out to the public site to provide written comment. There's 99 questions and you're not expected to provide comments on all 99, but if there's anything specific from your area of interest, you have until mid-February to provide that comment. So I just offer that up for public consumption.
Jason, it's Christy DeLaurentis. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, I just wanted to ask Lindsay just a couple of questions about outreach plans. So how are you proposing to try to get word out, and what was the result of the census activity trying to spur community members to be engaged in the process? So just wondering if you were looking at any of the results of census activity and trying to devise new strategies.
So that is a really good idea. I have not followed up with anyone involved in the census to see how effective that has been. But we do know that there have been ongoing events in the community, and we believe that we can safely partner with some of those events by having a table and being outside, hopefully with a little bit of decent weather still left, and handing out flyers about the project. And so things like there's a food delivery happening at the Overton School, and there have been things like I went to a redevelopment of a play lot and got to talk to a lot of community leaders. So I think it's just important to build up that network and have the people in the community help expand that network. And that might be partially through online social groups, Facebook being a primary one. There are neighborhood groups for the community, but walking around talking to people and trying to get the word out. But if there are suggestions for other ways, we're always open to more ideas.
So this is Emily. I do have a question. Wondering, Chicago United for Equity and a number of organizations around the country are promoting a pretty specific racial equity impact assessment process. And it sounds like a lot of your work is informed by that thinking, but I was wondering if there's an intentional plan to use a process like that as you move forward.
Yes, that is actually in our outline of how we're going to do this project, that we are going to do a racial equity impact assessment that was going to be led by the Chicago Department of Public Health and Metropolitan Planning Council and CMAP together. But right before, I think we were going to start in March, and then with coronavirus, the Chicago Department of Public Health got overwhelmed, and that initiative has taken a back seat. So we are now in talks to try and figure out if we can work with MPC, although we haven't done an REIA, we would like to do one for this project.
Excellent.
Okay, last call for questions or comments.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to agenda item 7.0, I believe Matt Stern has the floor for improving local development incentives.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Jason. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, thanks everyone for having me. So I'm here today to talk for just a few relatively short minutes about a project that we've been working on for the last year and a half or so. Back in January at what I believe was the last live in-person Economic Development Committee meeting, my colleague Lindsay Hollander presented on this project in its much earlier stages. I feel like it's hard to remember that far back at a time that we were all actually doing these things in person. And so I'm here to, we've sort of wrapped up the first big milestone in this project, and I'm here to talk a little bit about where we've come. So just to remind you, because it's been a little while, Lindsay had brought this project about reforming economic development incentives that are used by local governments in the region, and you gave us really helpful feedback about the scope and contents of that project at a fairly early stage. Austin, if you can go to the next slide for me. So we've continued to work on the project this year, and just last month we published Improving Local Development Incentives, Effective Practices for Local Governments in Northeastern Illinois. This is about a 30-page guide for local governments in the region. And I just want to talk a little bit today about what ended up making it into this guide, and thank you all for your support in producing it. And also invite you to read it, share it with your networks, and share any feedback that you have for us about it. Next slide. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the context for this project today, but it suffices to say that this work is a direct outgrowth of On2 2050, which calls for incentive reform, specifically incentive reform that increases transparency and accountability and aligns incentives with local and regional goals. On2 2050 specifically tasks CMAP with providing best practices and models to help local governments improve incentive use, and that's exactly what we sought to do here. Next slide. So as we developed the research for this project, we identified what we believe to be one of the central tensions for incentive use. On one hand, you have a universe of academic researchers and scholars who are, for the most part, agreed that incentives at best are inefficient tools for community and economic development, and that there are substantial concerns about the long-term local and regional consequences of incentive use. Some examples of that are that research indicates that a vast majority of incentives actually don't sway business location decisions at all. Even when they do, competition based on incentives and tax rates can result in bidding wars that drive tax revenues down over time. And then fighting over where in a region new development locates does very little for our competitiveness as a region. On the other hand, from the position of the individual taxing district, the use of incentives can be an incredibly rational decision. Communities face stiff competition from neighbors, whether it's neighboring jurisdictions or neighboring states. And revenue disbursement formulas oftentimes reward that competition, especially for over sales tax generating businesses. And then particularly in disinvested communities, slow growth, high property tax burdens, and limited staff capacity often make incentives one of the only tools in the toolbox. And so grappling with this sort of different, very different perspectives on incentives was a key part of us tackling this project. Next slide. So the format we ended up settling on for this was to create a guide or a handbook, something that we hope can serve as a ready resource for community and economic development professionals who work for and with taxing districts around the region. The guide reviews some basic data about the prevalence of incentives here in metropolitan Chicago and summarizes some of the clearest pitfalls to incentive use. But then we really spend the bulk of the guide laying out overarching principles and then a series of 10 evidence-based strategies for improving incentive use. And each strategy contains a series of specific implementable practices that we encourage taxing districts in the region to consider adopting. There are 60 of these implementable practices throughout the guide. Next slide. So the 4 key principles that we encourage in the guide that should be a factor in incentive use by local governments always are that incentives should be performance driven. Incentive use should be transparent. Incentive use should strive to promote and pursue equity goals. And incentives should be designed in such a way that they help us as a region pursue regional growth and regional benefits that extend beyond the lines of individual local taxing districts. Next slide. And so we lay out 10 strategies, and I won't dwell on these in much detail, just to summarize a few of them. Some of the strategies that are in the guide include using incentives to develop community benefits and advance racial and economic equity, targeting projects that can have the greatest potential for impact, designing incentives to promote high quality employment, and considering non-financial solutions to challenges faced by prospective businesses. So that last one means thinking about incentives that can provide solutions themselves as opposed to some sort of financial benefit to companies in the hopes that those solutions can be sustainably benefiting a variety of enterprises and developments over time, as opposed to the specific business receiving the development. And so, as you can tell from each of these, these are fairly broad. They're not necessarily implementable. They're just sort of thrusts of ideas. And so, the guide really dives down into each one of these to provide much more specific implementable recommendations. Next slide. So I'm only going to touch on one of these today, and the one I picked to talk about is providing using incentives to promote high quality employment. And so for each of these strategies, we identify a series of practices, and practices here include seeking first source hiring agreements, including job quality and job quantity requirements, investing in workforce development as a part of an incentive, funding tailored job training programs, creating reward structures and incentive structures that promote local hiring, support for better accommodations at work for employees with disabilities, rewarding local business-to-business purchasing, things like this. And as you can see, we break these practices down into 2 buckets. Standard practices, which we believe are in reach of most, if not all, taxing districts in the region who give incentives, and then best practices, things that are more contextual or specific, and may fit in many situations, but not necessarily all. And this sort of structure is consistent throughout the guide for all 10 of those strategies that were on the previous slide. Next slide, please. So this is meant as just a quick recap of our work. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and thank you for both your time at previous meetings and at this one, for the feedback that you've given on this project. Right after I stop, I'll drop a link to the guide, the one that's on the slide right now, as well as my email address. I would encourage ask you all to download the guide, take a look at it, share any feedback that you have with us, but also definitely to share it with your networks if you find it interesting and applicable. And I'd be happy to take any questions that folks might have now, or follow up with individual correspondence afterwards. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Not seeing any comments in the chat box. Just an FYI, Austin, the link in the agenda to the guide is not working, so that may need to be updated electronically. Second thing is, I do remember a fairly lively discussion on this back in January, so I'm glad that some of the feedback was able to make it into this product. And I know with all CMAP work, things are ongoing, and there may be updates made as we go forward. But I'd be interested in any committee members' reactions to this that deal directly with municipal incentives. Obviously, I'm guessing there's probably not many people on here who have downloaded the whole guide and read it, but anyone on the committee like to offer an initial reaction to either Matt's presentation, or if you have had a chance to look at it, what are your initial thoughts?
So this is Kevin Kramer here. I work for a local municipality in Hoffman Estates, and I'm the person who gets every call from the developers, site selectors, from anybody. And the question I'm always asked is, so what can you give us? And I often bring forward maybe less than half of the requests to our team, who tire of me bringing forward, hey, can we do anything for these guys? But I tell them, don't worry, I've already filtered out half. So yes, I deal with it often. I have downloaded it and printed it off. It's on my desk to read, so I'm looking forward to it. So thank you for that. I'm just wondering, because I haven't gotten to it yet, the thing that's top of my mind is retail incentives. So a lot of these things, like regional approaches, make sense for that, that big, pick a country, that big German pharmaceutical manufacturing company that we want to land here in the Chicago region because that will benefit. Do you address, though, retail? Because retail to me really is more, there is a direct benefit. I'm in Hoffman Estates, across the street is Schaumburg, and sometimes we'll fight for car dealers. And so there is a direct benefit to my taxpayer who's paying my money. If I can give, a quarter of the sales tax that this new car dealer that I'm stealing from my neighbor in town, do you address any of that, the retail side of things?
So we certainly seek to address that side of things, and by addressing a combination of developments, retail developments, employment, employment producing, economic developments, as well as residential construction and other sorts of things that can often receive incentives. By taking that broad approach, we appreciate that there are portions of the guide and certain recommendations that may be more applicable to some than others, or some of those types of developments than others. I would say that one of the challenges that I was getting at describing at the top about local competition is that while certainly incentivizing a sales tax producing business such as a car dealership makes sense in the context of the individual deal, one of the biggest challenges is, what happens to the next one? Say this incentive is 25%, the next one's 35%, and you see where it goes, and eventually, the competition between you and Schaumburg isn't giving you or Schaumburg much at all, and recognizing that's an underlying sort of long-term challenge to incentive use is something that we do focus on. This guide, this particular product, is focused on things that local governments can do now. And so we dwell less here on sort of larger systemic changes. But we absolutely understand and respect that there are larger systemic challenges that reinforce incentive use at the local level. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's good. Thank you for putting the time and effort into this, because like I said, I'm interested in reading it and bringing it back to our team, kind of some of these informal policies that we have that maybe we can formalize some of them using some tips in here. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And I'll say as well that that we have a number of other projects in this work stream that we're aiming to develop over the coming months. And so feedback about sort of additional ways that CMAP can support the region in this line of work is definitely something that I'm really interested in hearing.
Cool.
Okay. Any other questions? I think the only thing I would add is are there any lessons learned to what's happening to our friends to the north related to Kenosha and Foxconn, sort of as what's currently in the press and what's getting national attention around incentives? I realize you're not going to dissect that, but are those sort of news stories, were those part of putting together this guide? And are there others that you can look at as far as case studies potentially?
So the focus of this guide is very much on local incentives, and local incentives tend to not be in that category. And by that, I mean incentives given by local governments, be it municipalities, school districts, counties. And so we tend, by definition, to not be talking here as much about those mega deals, which often involve a large amount of state dollars. But there are some applicable lessons, certainly. And I think some of the things that we really highlight in the guide are the importance of designing incentives that are used in a performance-driven approach, so that money that is committed, if that ends up happening, is committed in exchange for real long-term commitments and investments on behalf of the entity receiving the investment. Or receiving the incentive, and making sure that deals are structured in such a way that guarantees that investment and that claws back that money or that incentive if that investment is not met.
Okay, thank you. No other comments or questions have come through the chat. Oh, please go ahead.
I have a question. So it seems to me that when you look at sort of the logic of the negotiation, you're dealing in a very asymmetric distribution of information, and it's constantly a process of gaming out what is it that is determinative for the developer as to what makes or breaks a deal. And has there been not much work done in terms of solving that asymmetric information issue?
Yeah, so this is something that we talked a lot about in researching this and in the interviews that we conducted around the region, as well as with sort of state and national experts on this topic. The information asymmetry is a challenge because we were really seeking to provide implementable, usable practices for local governments in the region. We didn't tackle that on a larger academic level, but some of the recommendations in the guide do focus on taking the time and energy and yes, cost to hire consultants and financial analysts to work on behalf of a municipality considering giving an incentive to really flush out as best as possible, recognizing that information asymmetry, whether the incentive is necessary, that but-for question, as well as really, inspecting developers' pro formas and making sure that as much information is known and understood as possible.
Where this has come up too is that I've done a couple of projects where we looked at the economic impact of some developments and potential impact. And then in talking to the developer, they often go in and I think Kevin made the point. They go in with the idea that they structure their deal around an incentive or set of incentives. So they assume tax increment financing, they assume things and don't even consider the possibility of a deal that doesn't have that. So there's sort of, it's baked into the way they approach a project is, so the but-for analysis in part is something that frankly the developer may not have been considering. Developer just goes in and says, these are how we are going to do the pro formas, these are the numbers, and then, but they're all assuming a TIF or something else as part of the deal. Just an observation is something I've seen on, in talking to developers as they approach a state or a community about a project.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think it gets back to Kevin's comment about competition, is that when incentives are available, they become a part of the ask. And so grappling with that, I think, is part of the larger challenge here. So I certainly agree. I think one other point that comes up in some of the academic scholarship is how hard it is to really ever answer these questions beforehand. Is it really possible to really know the answer to a but-for question? And I think one of the ways that comes through in the recommendations that we put forth in the guide is about the importance of engaging in after-the-fact evaluation of deals, and really taking the time to understand, hey, this incentive that we gave, what did it end up netting out from a community development perspective, from an economic benefits perspective, and how can we use that information to enhance things that we do in the future.
I will jump in. Sorry, go ahead, Jennifer.
Sorry, no, I was just going to add to that. This is a great discussion. I was part of the process. This was a great process that you all ran, but I was part of some of the interviews, and I work for Ernst & Young, and I've been working with incentives for the last 20 years, prior to Ernst & Young, and consulting on behalf of municipalities as well as investors and corporate businesses. And I think these points are very, very well taken. And I also think that it's an education process constantly, for the communities that always have got, turnover with appointed and elected officials, as well as with the developers. So whoever I'm, working with, to me, it's always about the project and what's the right thing for the project, and that there has to be this understanding that you've got to look at this deal, with and without the incentives in a real way. And to Matt's point, and that was something we talked a lot about, was really just kind of this true up and this look back. So when you look at, state programs and state incentives that are, I'll say, relatively easy on the compliance side, did it create this many jobs? What are the wages? And, you're following up with that annual compliance depending on what type of credit you're talking about. Development incentives in terms of TIF or other things like that, it's possible on that too, to do an annual or some other type of true up and looking at, the actuals of the project and it can be tedious, but it's absolutely doable. And I think it's an important thing to do to really measure, the appropriateness of the incentive and just scale it back in some cases if the project, was more successful and maybe didn't require as much as originally anticipated. So I just think it's a constant education and, kind of working together in a partnership. But it is something that's doable. It's not always perfect, but, I think we could get there and try to do better on every project. But good comments.
Jason, can I ask a question of Matthew before we wrap up? It's Christy DeLaurentis.
Please go ahead.
Sure. So Matthew, Christy DeLaurentis from South Suburban Mayors and Managers, representing 45 municipalities in the South Suburbs that utilize incentives often. I have a question for you. I have not gone through the entire report. I have looked at some of the sections, but wanted to know if you drilled down into some of the differences within the Chicago region at the county level, how incentives are used, and what various kind of best practice programs may be out there that others can think about. And I'm wondering specifically if there's a lot of variability within Cook County that has, the 10-25 dichotomy with assessment rates and whatnot versus, a more uniform level in the collar counties.
Yeah, so we have not, I think, done the detailed look that you're looking for yet in this process. I think two of the next products that we're hoping to produce in this work stream, one of them is a prevalence report where we hope to update data that CMAP has published on in the past. It's been a couple of years since we've put something out on this, but really updating a prevalence analysis of incentives across the region, something we hope to produce in mid-2021, as well as some additional work looking really at ways that we can support even more concretely than this guide, implementing some of the practices that are outlined in this guide, which I think will require a little bit more of a sub-regional breakdown. So we've begun to do that internally, and hoping to do to do more and publish on more of that in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. It's we're definitely well aware that the situation when it comes to attracting development and utilizing incentives is looks very different in different parts of the region.
Yeah, one thing that I'll say is that we've been doing our own research and looking at the use of the county incentive in really essentially what is the anticipated benefit at the municipal level. So what are the approvals, the resolution, what do they say in terms of amount of investment, and actually what's given back in terms of class 6, 7, or 8 incentive, and often the benefit to the developer is smaller than anticipated. So again, really kind of getting back down to those nuts and bolts. What are they actually coming away with? So it's not seen as a giveaway so much as a partnership going forward. And so kind of truing up those numbers, I think, take amount of due diligence, but I think that's something that needs to get done on a regular basis too, because there is this idea that, if they ask for an incentive and are investing $1 million, they're going to get, X in a, an abatement, which is seen as, kind of giving up public dollars, but it really is an offset for future dollars. But if the investment doesn't come, then the jobs don't appear, et cetera. So in our, you touched on this in the divested area, it's really important, and it's often the only way we can recruit new investment into our area because of the high tax rates. So it's a, it's a vicious cycle, admittedly, but it's the only way to get anything done. So yeah, appreciate you trying to dive down into the sub-regional level too. I think that's important.
Yeah, thank you. And we're certainly looking forward to more opportunities to chat with you, Christy, and SSMMA and bring some of these learnings to that space.
Okay, thank you very much to Matt and that report. Moving along to other business, the only thing that I would add to this is thank you all for a very good year as we've adapted to this environment, and I hope that today finds you and your family safe and sound and dealing with the pandemic the best that we can. Something I've been thinking about as we move into 2021 is that if anyone on the committee would like to get on the calendar for even 30 minutes to talk about directionally what you'd like to see for this group into the next year, I'm happy to sit down, or if you'd like to get with Austin. I think now is a good time to do this as we think about not just reflecting on our 2020 and 2019 now that 2050 is out and the different strategies are moving forward, as we think about how this group evolves and the kind of intel that we provide, but also the kind of intel that we collect. I'd like to have more of an opportunity to engage others in their work and to be able to spotlight or highlight things that are happening around our county, multi-county region. So if anyone would like to again chat with me or Austin in the next 45 or 60 days, I'm happy to do that. Get with Austin, and we can put something on the calendar. So I just put that forward as a thank you, but also be an opportunity to engage with you further as we move into 2021. There was a question by Emily getting back to the CRGC conversation, so that will be noted in the notes. And then there was a question about when will the video of today's meeting be available and where. Austin, can you handle that one?
It will be available on YouTube. The recording, I'll have it in the next couple of minutes after we're finished, and I think our communication team should have it up in the next day or two, but I can send it to you, Peter, when it's available.
Great, thank you. Another question came through is, are we planning on having any site visits for next year? Austin?
We would love to. I think that's all dependent on how the pandemic takes shape in the next year. Let's all hope that by next summer, the weather will be nicer and we'll be a little bit more free to visit around the region.
But that being said, if there are ideas from the committee for visits, we'll be happy to take those. And if there are any opportunities to even do something digitally, that might be neat as people walk around with a video camera or something, or doing a live stream from one of their sites might be an interesting idea. But not sure how that would work, but something to maybe consider.
We can all get virtual reality headsets.
Yeah.
Let me add, Jason, if you don't mind. I want to second what you said earlier. We are going through the process of work planning for the next year and thinking about where we want this committee to go. I view our quarterly meetings as really just the drumbeat to engagement with CMAP to make sure that we're sort of checking in regularly with each other. But I would hope that there are many other opportunities along the way to engage in individual projects. As Jennifer said earlier, several of you were really key in helping the project team for the guide sort of think through their recommendations and strategies. And that is the same is also true on a number of other projects that we have coming down the pipe. In particular, I wanted to share that CMAP has been asked to host a regional recovery task force. This is a bit of a follow-on to the mayor's recovery task force and to some of the recommendations that they put forward in their Forward Together report. They recognize that several of their recommendations were already well embodied in the On to 2050 plan. It needed to take place at a regional level. This is particularly around how we can better coordinate the workforce system and try to meet the moment, and given the current unemployment levels, as well as many of the industry strategies and other things that are included in the report. As you can imagine, that is a pretty fluid situation, and we are still determining the path forward there. The first meeting of that task force will be on November 9th, and I think that, as given the conversation earlier around the suspension of CRGC, it's really on CMAP and on our committees, including the Economic Development Committee, to be those regional tables and to provide feedback on some of the work that that task force will be taking on. So we're not quite sure how we're going to involve the committees yet, but as we look forward to our January meeting, we'll be looking to engage many of you further and then report back on how that work is going. And I think as we all sort of reflect on the pandemic and on the recession, I hope that we're all feeling the opportunity to look towards more long-term strategic planning related strategies. And I think that as we get out of the sort of immediate crisis response and into sort of long-term recovery, we can think about how the work plan for this committee can best support that, particularly in trying to address issues that we haven't discussed as much in the last couple of years around workforce and education opportunities and career pathways, and some of those recommendations in the On to 2050 plan. But if there are any thoughts that y'all want to share today, or just updates from your organizations and around the region, we'd love to hear them.
Okay, thank you, Austin. Any other business from a committee member that they would like to share? Okay, hearing none, we move on to public comment. Any public comment for the betterment of the group?
There were no submissions for public comment by email for that much.
Okay, thank you. All right. So with that, I believe we are at the end of our agenda, noting that the next committee meeting will be January 26th. If there's any agenda items or suggestions, or again, just want to talk about strategy, let's find a time to connect. Oh, is it the 25th or the 26th, Austin?
I won't be honest, I haven't looked at the calendar recently, but it will be the fourth Monday.
Okay, so it would be it's still a Monday?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so on the agenda we actually talked about the 26th, but it's actually the 25th.
We'll get it corrected.
We'll get it corrected. Okay. All right. So with that, do I have a motion to close?
So moved.
Okay. Thank you very much, and wish you all a happy rest of the year, and we will talk again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.